Hello students, welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to learn one of the simplest, but at the same time, one of the most important endgames in chess. We're going to learn how to win when we have our king and only one pawn left versus our opponent's king. So we already talked about the rule of the square and we know exactly what to do when the king is out of that square. So if the king was over here, all we need to do is push the pawn. He's going to become a queen easily, and then we do the king and queen checkmate. But in this class, it's going to be about how to win when the king is inside the square in front of the pawn and being able to capture. So I'm going to show you mainly my way. There are different ways to approach this endgame, but I'm going to show you, of course, the right way, but I'm going to tell you a few tips that make it easier for me to remember. So there are two main concepts that we have to understand, and before we get to it, just know that the idea is that this pawn is going to be going down this road, and he needs the help of the king. If I just push the pawn up by himself, he's going to be captured in no time. So this is pretty obvious, but we have to get this idea. And to me, I really like to think of, again, the pawn going down the road. That's what he needs to do in order to become a queen and win the game afterwards. But then I think of it like the dad and his son. The dad is going to be stronger, so he goes ahead, making sure that the road is safe, and only then the pawn goes afterwards. So with that analogy, I'm going to start talking about this first concept, and let me actually remove the pawn. I'm going to show you this position. Let me put the kings here. And the first concept is opposition. Now, opposition refers to this position where we have the two kings facing each other with only one square in between. And we have frontal opposition, we have lateral opposition, and we have diagonal opposition. But the key point is that there's one square in between, only one square. When we have lateral, it's the same thing, one square in between. So now we know what opposition means, but the important thing is not to just have it on the board. The important thing is to take the opposition. What does that mean? Well, let me show you. Let's say we have this position. Taking the opposition means that I'm going to be the one getting in front of my opponent's king. So now I'm in control of this endgame, and you're going to see what I mean. So now, if you remember, this side of the board is what we call the white pieces camp. And of course, this is going to be the black pieces camp. Well, since I was the one who took the opposition, it's his turn to move, and when he moves, I'm going to be able to penetrate or gain more territory. So he cannot go here, here, or here. So anywhere he goes, I'm going to penetrate. If he goes here, I get into his camp. If he moves to the other side, I go through here. And of course, if he moves back, then I could just go to any of these squares. So taking the opposition allows you to gain more space. If I go back and it's the black pieces to move here, they could easily take the opposition, and then when I move, they penetrate. Now, why is this so important? Why do we want to take the opposition so much? Well, don't forget that our main goal is to get our pawn from our territory into their territory and promote. So we need to use this concept of opposition to gain space and help the pawn. And it's going to make more sense once we start. So let me go back to that position. Now here we are, guys, but before we start, I really need you to make sure that you understand the concept of taking the opposition. So if you need to, pause the video, say it out loud if you need to, but make sure that you understand it. Before we talk about how to win, we're going to see how our opponent could use the concept of opposition to not let us win. So let's say it's the black pieces to move here, and of course they're going to move forward, and by the moment we get here, they're going to take the opposition. So he's not going to allow me to gain more space. So if I move over here, well, he goes in for my pawn. You see, he's coming into my territory. If I go to the other side, then he's going to continue to take the opposition just to not let me get in. If I move again, he keeps taking the opposition. Now, if I use my pawn, he's just going to get in front of the pawn and forget about it. He goes back, okay, but the moment I show up, he takes the opposition. So that's the only thing in his head, taking the opposition. If I go back, he goes back here. He gains more terrain. If I keep putting him in check, My pawn keeps getting closer, but you're going to see what happens. I keep showing up, so my pawn keeps getting closer, and then you see, finally, he takes the opposition, and when I push a pawn, he gets in front of the pawn, and now I have two choices. Either I move away, but he takes me, or I try to hold on to my pawn, but then this is stalemate. My opponent's king cannot go anywhere, and he's not in check. And if you think about it, guys, this has a lot to do with what I said at the very beginning. We have to always keep the king ahead of the pawn. And when we did this, thanks to his great job with the opposition, I was never able to get my king ahead of the pawn. So the moment I did it, I had to use my pawn to attack his king, and my king was never able to get in front of the pawn. So that's basically what he did. Now it's time to talk about the second concept, and this is the concept of the key squares. Now the key squares are just for you to understand where your king has to be at all times. So if you know where your king goes, then you're going to be able to do the opposition and you could win this easily. And to be honest, guys, some people don't even need to know about opposition at this point. If you understand the key squares concept, that could be enough. At the same time, some people like myself, when I first learned this, I never learned about the key squares. I just knew the concept of opposition, and it was enough for me. Now, you're going to have both. So it's going to be up to you if you pick one or the other, or if you combine them both like many of my students do. So let me tell you what the key squares are. Now you know that if this king gets too active, he will not let me gain space and win. So each pawn is going to have their key squares. For this pawn, the key squares are going to be the three squares in front of them with one rank in between. So in other words, it's not going to be these three, it's going to be the three squares on the next rank. So one rank in between. So if this pawn is on e3, the key squares are going to be now these three squares. Always one rank in between, those are going to be the key squares. And of course, if the pawn is on e4, which squares do you think are going to be the key squares? So pause the video, think about it, and as I explain this, guys, try to understand. So the key squares are going to be these three squares. Now, why is this so important? Because that's where your king has to be at all times. If you just manage to get your king to those key squares, you're guaranteed to win this endgame. If you don't, most likely it's going to be a draw. So now that we understand the key squares, now that we understand the concept of opposition, we're going to put everything together. As I do this, you're going to see on the left everything we've gone over so far. And on the right, I'm going to be listing the steps that go through my head as I do this. This is just the way that I think about it. It's almost the same thing, but it makes it easier for me to remember. When I start, the first thing that comes to mind is I need my king ahead of the pawn. That's the first step. And you could think also, I need to go for the key squares. So anyways, I start pushing my pawn up, and then when it's my turn, I'm going to get to the key squares. Now, for me, in my head, this is not enough. The second step on my list is taking the opposition as quickly as I can. You can never go wrong, guys, if you take the opposition. So many of my students, when they learn this and then a few months or years down the road, I ask them, they tell me, oh, I don't remember that well, but I know the king has to be ahead of the pawn and I need to take the opposition. And that's enough to make it work. So I'm going to take the opposition. So I'm going to go on e4. And then you're going to see when he moves, I'm going to be able to gain more space. Now, to understand this part, why do we really want to take the opposition here? Let's go back again to the idea of the road. So this is the opposition that I really want to take because I'm on that road. So right now my king is going to help the pawn to get to this square, and this square. But I really want to get this square as well because then I have more access to that road. So what I'm doing here is I'm waiting for that king to move, and then I'm going to go in to access it. So if the king now moves to the side, I go here, and now I'm helping the pawn all the way to the 6th rank. So we're going to call this the little trick to access one more square. So I'm going in here to wait for this king. This is the waiting game, if you want. So I'm sitting here waiting for him to move. The moment he moves, I access that square. So that's why the opposition is so powerful. So I'm always looking for opposition. Let's say my opponent's king had gone here instead. Well, I'm going to take the opposition. Then he moves. This is the one that I want on the road, and finally when he moves, I gain space. Now I go back again. Let's say that instead he had gone over here. Well, I take diagonal opposition. I'm always looking for opposition. It's like a combat or a dance between the two kings. So he moves here now, opposition, frontal opposition. He moves, and I access that square again. Now, that's in my head. I'm fighting for the opposition. But now, just to show you how key the key squares are, you're going to see that even if I go here, let's say I didn't want to take the opposition, I didn't know that concept. If I get to the key square, it also works. Because now, if they take the opposition, it's true that I cannot go in, but this is when leaving one rank in between is so important. Now all I do is I use my spare move. He took the opposition, I'm in trouble, I just use my pawn. He's still behind the king, and this is very important. Every time I move my pawn, I need to do it in my head first, make sure that the pawn is going to remain behind the king. So this is a cool tool to just pass the turn to my opponent. So you see now, he's the one who needs to move, and I sort of get synchronized again. I took the opposition, he has to move, and I gain space. So anyways, getting to the key squares is enough. In my head, I want to take the opposition. He moves, I gain space. So this is going to be the next concept. King ahead of the pawn, I take the opposition, and soon after I take the opposition on the road, I'm going to gain space. So I went from controlling 1, 2, 3 to controlling the fourth one. So let's say now he goes here. Well, it's time to push my pawn. So after I penetrated, I gain space, I'm bringing my pawn. So I do it in my head first. Is my pawn going to be behind the king? Yes. I do it, check. And now my opponent could do one of two things. He could go here, which is really dangerous for him. Now I push the pawn, and he's risking to get outside of the box or the square. So my pawn is probably going to make it without any problem. Or he could go down, and this is what he should do. He could go here to get in front of the pawn. If he did that, I have to do my next move. Now the next move, guys, pause the video if you need to try to think of what the next move would be. Now you could get to the next move in 3 different ways. So I have like 3 different ways to remember this. Number 1, you could know it if you remember the concept of opposition. So I'm going to go here and I'm doing lateral opposition. So that's one way that I remember it. You could also remember it if you think of the fact that I'm trying to help the pawn get to the next square. So I know that by going to f6, I'm controlling one more square. I'm gaining more territory down the road. So opposition could work, gaining more space could work, but also the key squares. The pawn is here, his key squares are going to be here. That's where my king wants to go. And then lastly, you need to remember that the pawn is never going to be right next to the king. So we know this is not the move. So it's moving the king, and we go to f6. So I gain more space, the king has to move. Now the pawn is going to be behind the king, so that's good. And then guys, once the pawn gets to the 5th rank, the key squares change. So it's not going to be this anymore. It's going to be the 3 squares right in front of him. So this is one of the main rules. Once the pawn is on the 5th rank, and for that you count 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, then the key squares are going to be the 3 right in front of him. So that means that if my king gets to the 6th rank before the pawn, I'm going to win this no matter what. So I got there. He's going to move either in front of the pawn, that's what he should do, or he's going to do something else. If he does something else, then I'm going to access the last square. Now my king is supporting the pawn all the way through. I push, and I get my queen, and then you know how to do the queen and king checkmate. Now, if he doesn't want to make it easy for me, he wants to actually go in there so that I cannot access the last square. We know the trick. Remember, I told you about the trick to access that last square. We do the waiting game, we do the opposition, whatever you want to call it, but I take frontal opposition. Now, I just sit here, he has to move. When he does, I penetrate, and I'm helping my pawn get to the end. If he had gone to the other side, I penetrate through here, and then I push the pawn. So I told you that after frontal opposition, we're going to penetrate, and then we just push the pawn. And that's it. At this point, guys, all you have left to do is practice, practice, and practice. I'm going to show you how you could practice this and sort of take a test. But if you have someone at home, that's great. Just practice at home as much as you can. If you don't, you're going to go to this website that I'm using, and I'm leaving the link in the description in case you need it. You click on it, you create a free account if you don't have it, and then once you are on your homepage, let me go to homepage, you're going to see here on the left, it says puzzles. Under puzzles, you go to drills, and then here you go to endgame fundamentals. The first one, you're going to click here, and it's going to have you take this drill. So it's going to have the king already on the 6th rank. We know the rule. If the king gets to the 6th rank before the pawn, we're going to win this. So just push the pawn and finish it. But then we also have, if we go back to puzzles, drills, endgame fundamentals, the second one is going to be from the very beginning. So I'm going to take it myself. If you guys take this drill and you pass it, then you know how to do this. If you don't, go back to the video, review it, and send me any questions that you might have. So let me do it myself here quickly. First, king ahead of the pawn. So you see the computer is playing. King ahead of the pawn. Now I'm going to take the opposition. Then he's already on the road. I need to access that square. So take the opposition. He moved. Now here it's even better. I'm going to take more opposition. He goes there, opposition. So this robot is not actually doing that well. Now I penetrate. Remember, frontal opposition on the road, I gain more space. And look at this. Should I? Well, let me just do it again. Opposition, gain more space. Now I'm going to start bringing the pawn. Now look at this. If I push the pawn, he's going to take me. So the dad needs to come back from the pawn. So if you understand these concepts, I'm on the key squares. I'm taking opposition, just whatever helps you remember. So I push, pawn is behind the king, so it works. My king is already on the 6th rank, and my pawn is on the 5th rank. So we know we're going to win this no matter what. I'm helping him get all the way through, but I need that one. And we know the trick. Opposition, I'm waiting for him to move. Finally, I access the whole thing. So I push, push, and I got my queen. Now, this drill is going to ask you to finish him all the way to the end, so it's going to help you practice the queen and king checkmate. I'm going to leave it here, guys, because we've already covered how to do this, but feel free to ask me any questions that you might have. And next class, we're going to go over a few other things regarding this endgame, but until then, practice as much as you can.